the bill, right? He argued that the priority should be to get criminals off the streets, and it didn't matter whether or not they were victims of society, according to Joe Biden. I'm going to play it. It's really short.
If we can keep our minimum mandatory sentencing provisions, if we can put more police officers on the streets, if we can build more courts, have more prosecutors, if we will commit ourselves to be as outraged about crime as the people who are victims are outraged, I believe we're going to begin to turn the tide, and I believe this bill is going to be an important part of it. I yield the floor.
Senator's time has expired. Senator from Delaware.
Madam President, I yield myself 3 minutes. Madam President, it's been a real pleasure to work with my friend from Texas. We most times are on opposite sides of issues. This time we're on the same side, but it is. I realize in this business it's difficult for us to, notwithstanding the fact we're personally cooperating on this bill, for us to dismiss the prospect of some partisanship. Let me set the record straight on this bill. The underlying bill, which is now the Biden-Hatch bill, was the Biden bill. A guy named Biden wrote that bill, and he wrote that bill by going down and sitting down with the President of the United States of America, not with his Attorney General, not with anyone else, with Bill Clinton, President of the United States of America, who between the time he got elected in November until the time he was sworn in, called me at my home on 6 separate occasions. And he unfortunately doesn't need a lot of sleep. Sometimes literally, and I say this on the record, as late as 11:30 at night, to discuss why I wasn't moving quicker on the Biden crime bill from before. I sat with him, not with his Attorney General. He wanted 100,000 policemen. He does not view this as a social issue as opposed to trying to bring peace and security to the streets. As governor of the state of Arkansas, he presided over, as governor, the execution of individuals within the state and the death penalty. He supports the death penalty. He is the fellow who insisted that I bump this up from initially to when I said, where are we going to get the money? He said, well, all I know is I want 100,000 cops. I made that commitment. He had endorsed the Biden crime bill as a candidate when he ran. He is the one who talks about the need for stiffer penalties. So notwithstanding the fact, some of the old Democrats and former presidents who were Democrats before Carter, I suspect, I don't know who we're talking about here, but in the old days, it is true. When Richard Nixon was running for president, Richard Nixon used to talk about law and order, and the Democratic response was law and order with justice, whatever either one of those meant. I never knew. I was running then in 1972. I didn't think Richard Nixon knew what it meant, and I didn't think the opposition knew what it meant. This president is very, very straightforward and simple. He knows there are 2 basic steps here. One step is you must take back the streets. And you take back the streets by more cops, more prisons, more physical protection for the people. He also understands what my friend from Texas understands, and he doesn't talk a lot about, but he signed on to in this bill. He also understands the need to keep people who are first-time offenders, who are nonviolent offenders, or who are potential time offenders who haven't gotten, I yield myself an additional 3 minutes, who in fact are people who are getting themselves into the crime stream for the first time, that they should be diverted from the system. So I hope this crime bill, when it passes, the Biden-Hatch crime bill, as it becomes law, God willing, I hope that we will have ended once and for all this notion that is a hangover from the 60s, that somehow Democrats are weak on crime and Democratic presidents are weak on crime and Republicans are tough on crime. The truth is, every major crime bill since 1976 that's come out of this Congress, every minor crime bill has had the name of the Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, Joe Biden, on that bill, and has had a majority vote of the Democratic members of the United States Senate on the bill. So one of the things I want to do in addition to end the crime is end the political carnage that goes on when we talk about crime. Crime is not Democrat or Republican. Making the streets safe is not a Democratic or Republican issue.
I'm not going to play it because we don't have much time. I'm not going to play the rest of it. Y'all will be able to watch the rest of it. I guess when I upload it to Blackboard. Kind of the point, though, if you thought that all of this was just kind of interpretation, right? You can kind of see that Joe Biden in '94 was basically saying, was was pretty explicit, right? And he goes on to argue, right, that that the priority should be to get criminals, whatever that means, off the street. And it didn't matter to him, like all of the things like whether or not they were victims of society or the circumstances or whatnot, right? There was a commitment by Democrats such as Joe Biden to create for more police and more prisons. And just as I said, and Delroy asked, how does this contrast from what the conservatives wanted at the time? And the answer is that it doesn't really, right? It's about demonstrating, right, that the Democrats were just as tough on crime as Republicans. At the time, Democrats were getting beaten by Republicans such as Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, because the perception was that they were not that by championing things like social programs, right, for the poor, or championing civil rights and all, the Democrats were being depicted by conservatives as being weak on crime, right, and they were losing elections because of it. This is, that's the context, right? So this is kind of about
if we can keep our minimum mandatory sentencing provision.
About throwing poor people and particularly like poor Black people under the bus. This is about Democrats throwing poor Black people under the bus in order to save their own electoral hides, if you will, right? In 82, and there's not too, I'm gonna move forward. There's only a few more slides. In 82, George Kelling and James Q. Wilson, these were, two social scientists, argued in the Atlantic Monthly that minor instances of disorder, such as like abandoned cars or panhandling in a community, if left unattended, inevitably led to major crimes such as like rape and murder, because it supposedly demonstrates that nobody cares about or is watching over the community, right? Their argument was largely hypothetical, right? It was unproven, right? It was kind of anecdotal, but the idea was taken up by city officials like Rudy Giuliani in the 90s and Michael Bloomberg in the 2000s, and in Los Angeles as a way of linking impediments to gentrification, such as like homeless people, right, to serious crime, and thus justifying police crackdowns on poor urban dwellers, right? So remember we talked about like gentrification before, right? And how that and city officials kind of promoting gentrification, or this idea of broken windows theory became a justification for using police, for increasing city police forces and using them to crack down on those people who were seen as kind of impediments to gentrification, right? Like homeless people using public space for survival, right? Officials claimed that broken windows policing was responsible for the historic decline in crime during the 90s, but cities that had not adopted the practice saw similar reductions in crime. So that couldn't be the issue. That couldn't be what was going on. Right. And to this day, we're not totally clear on what caused the decline in crime in the late 90s. Right. While some have called the growing prison population in the U.S. Mass incarceration, right? Many of us have heard that term. Others, like sociologist Loic Wacant, right, refers to it as hyper incarceration. This is an important term because it doesn't just cast like a wide net over all of society, right? The prison system does not do that. According to Wacant, people are targeted by class, then race, and then geography. How does that work? People who are underemployed and unemployed make up nearly all prisoners, right? So the prison population in the United States is largely made up of poor people, right? It's largely made up of poor people. It's almost entirely made up of poor people. And in particular, okay, it is Black and brown people from the inner cities, right? So it's not even necessarily all Black and brown people, right? But it is Black and brown people who are inhabiting disinvested and potentially gentrifying areas of inner cities, right? So for instance, like in like the inner cities of many Midwestern cities, right? Okay, and that way targeted first by class, then by race, and then by geography. And so this hyper incarceration results in significant stigma and curtailment of citizenship, and more on that in a little bit. I will play this entire video. No, actually, I won't, because we're running out of time. So in her important video, and you can go over this because guaranteed this is going to be on the exam, right? So in her important book, Golden Gulag, about the growth of the California prison system in the 80s, in the 80s and the 90s, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a professor at the CUNY Graduate Center in the geography program, explains that the extreme expansion of prisons in California during this time was a fix, if you will, for several interrelated crises or surpluses, if you will, right? Okay, the way it works is that she said that there's a surplus of labor during the post-war period in California. There were too many people who did not have jobs, right? So there was a large surplus labor force, right? Particularly, these are Black and brown people in inner city areas, right, in California. Okay. There was also a surplus of land. There was too much underutilized land in California. There were the cost of land declined as the agricultural industry in California went through a downturn, and so lots and lots of farmers were looking to offload their land. So there was kind of underutilized land that was cheap, right? I'm sorry, as far as labor, there was also a significant amount of suburban and rural surplus of labor, right? So in small towns, there was, a lot of small towns were having trouble coming back after the pullout of the defense contractor industry in California. So there was a surplus of finance capital. So there's too much money concentrated in banks, right? Which, that has to kind of be loaned out because money just sitting in a bank that's not being utilized doesn't make money, and kind of means nothing, right? Money is not useful if it's not in circulation, right? And state capacity, and there was a surplus of state capacity, or there's kind of too much underutilized bureaucratic power after the decline of the welfare state, right? After Reaganomics, if you will. Let's see. So basically what California state did, what the government did, is that they borrowed money to purchase underutilized land. This was mainly like unused farmland in rural areas of California. And what they did was they built prisons, right, in those areas. They built state prisons in those areas, very similar to the way that in New York, you notice how a lot of the state prisons in New York are in rural areas upstate. It's the same way in California. So they built prisons and they employed people in rural areas in those prisons. And so they were able to get those people jobs, and then they used those prisons to house the surplus labor from gentrifying inner city areas, such as in like LA and San Francisco and Oakland and all, right? So it's an interesting kind of this is for Professor Gilmore. This was a way of explaining the how prisons were used to basically prop up the economy, the faltering economy of California during the 1980s and the 1990s. Okay, in response to the urban rebellions and civil rights protests of the 60s and 70s, cities like Philadelphia, Los Angeles, New York City, they invested heavily in more police and upgraded equipment, right? There was lots and lots of political will for them to do so, right? There was this depiction of cities like Philly and LA and New York City, like these kind of urban jungles that required kind of military grade equipment, right? SWAT teams were created during this time, and they were quickly formed in large cities, right? These special police units were increasingly deployed during the war on drugs. not for like tactical maneuvers and and taking out like terrorists or whatever, not why or something like that, but rather kind of mundane like police raids on houses in poor neighborhoods, right? In 97, the Clinton administration launched the Department of Defense's 1033 program. Okay, and what the 1033 program is, and that's actually a link to a very short article about it. It's basically a program that allows for the transfer of secondhand military equipment, Humvees, helicopters, rocket launchers, all sorts of foolishness, right? Tactical equipment from the U.S. military, right, to local police forces. And so this gives domestic forces access to literal weapons of war, right? But it also provides a kind of outlet for the surplus of military equipment that was created by contractors for the U.S.'s wars abroad, right? So now all that military equipment takes on a new life on the streets of the United States, right? We saw some of that when during the Ferguson uprising, when military equipment, Humvees, and tanks, literal tanks, were brought in onto the streets of Ferguson to quell the unrest and to restore supposed order, right? Stop and frisk policing. So let's see, of the almost 700 stops and frisks in 2011, right, in New York City, 9 out of 10 of those stopped had not committed any offense, right? Were completely innocent, right? 87% of those stopped and frisked were Black or Latino, and of course together in New York City make up about 53% of the population. Of those people who were stopped and frisked in New York City in the 90s and the early 2000s, of those found with a weapon, 1 in 49 whites were found with a weapon who were stopped and frisked. 1 in 71 Latinos and 1 in 93 Blacks stopped had a weapon, meaning whites were more likely, even though whites accounted for only 13% of stops. They were more likely to be carrying weapons than either Latinos or Blacks, right? However, Mayor Bloomberg at the time argued that stop and frisk was to go after illegal weapons, right? It is important to recognize that that until he wasn't, the current new mayor, Eric Adams, was a defender of stop and frisk, and there is talk now of reinstating some sort of stop and frisk, because the new mayor ran on a law and order platform during his campaign for mayor. Right, of 4.3 million street stops under Bloomberg, 88% of them yielded no arrest or summons. Right, the idea, according to Bloomberg at the time, it's funny because Eric Adams said this a long time ago. The goal was to make sure that Black and Latino young men in particular were aware that someone was always watching, that the police were watching them every time they stepped outside of their doors, in order to ensure supposedly that they would not engage in any kind of wrongdoing, according to Michael Bloomberg, right? This hyper-incarceration, is so this kind of hyper-incarceration is so finely targeted that researchers have identified numerous $1 million blocks, the term, $1 million blocks in some cities. So $1 million block is a city block where states spend over $1 million to incarcerate its residents, a single block. And this is extraordinary extraction of resources from already poor communities, and an enormous waste of state resources. They're almost exclusively in poor Black and Latino communities, right? So this is actually a map of several $1 million blocks in Brooklyn, right? And you can see where they are concentrated, right? In Bed-Stuy, right, in East New York and Canarsie. That's where they're generally kind of, and some of them in Brownsville, right. This is where those $1 million blocks are concentrated. Notice that you don't see that in places like Bay Ridge, Borough Park, or even like Sunset Park, or in South Brooklyn by and large, right. Okay, so near the, of course, once one is arrested and released, right? If one has a felony conviction, then it turns out that takes away a whole lot of your rights, right? In a lot of states permanently. So nearly 6 million Americans are barred from voting for committing a felony, including about 2.2 million African Americans. And so the question is, well, why should felons be denied the right to vote? Didn't they do their time? Right? How well, and so in places like Florida, where there have been battles for several years over reinstating the voting rights of convicted felons who are no longer in prison, right? Effectively, that has removed large numbers of African Americans from the voting rolls, and has had a significant effect on the electoral prospects for say like Democrats in places like Florida. And in that way, we can say that we can speak of a kind of carceral citizenship, right, where and we can that's maybe what we can describe as an alternative citizenship, right? Track unique to largely race and gendered targets of the criminal justice system, Black and Latino men of the criminal justice system who are marked by a criminal record, right? So in a relatively recent report by the American Bar Foundation, revealed that nearly 45,000 laws restrict former prisoners, not even people who are in prison, but former prisoners' mobility through probation laws, right? The domain of these policies range from limiting the franchise to diminishing access to public housing and private housing, because people with criminal records can be discriminated against in the private housing market, right? They can be denied things like apartments and all. Food stamps, these are former incarcerated folks or former felons can be denied food stamps, jobs, education, access to business licenses, all sorts of stuff, thereby undermining their ability to even establish themselves once they get out of prison, right? So these legal restrictions dictate where former prisoners can live, what kinds of occupations they can take up, and with whom they can even associate, right? Making it impossible. You couldn't even move. Maybe you couldn't even move back in with your mom after such a, particularly if she lived in public housing. That was a provision of the '94 crime bill, right? And in that, the prison abolition movement. So in the 1970s. Activists, mostly in California and New York, began organizing around the idea that prisons are a tool of racial capitalist control, aimed at poor Black and brown people who were being displaced by the restructuring global economy, right? So Black and brown people, poor Black and brown people are oftentimes, kind of rendered surplus labor in the restructuring economy. So what do you do with those people, right? You can't just let them run around, right? And so excess policing and the prison system has kind of emerged in the United States as a way of warehousing that surplus labor and controlling those surplus labor populations. Specifically, prison abolitionists argue against the idea that building prisons and locking up people makes communities safe, right? There is a kind of a liberal framing of building prisons and police that suggests that police are here to like protect you and to make communities safe, right? But that's not necessarily, but in oftentimes instead, oftentimes police and prisons work to continue destabilizing poor working class communities, making them less safe, right? Instead, therefore, communities are made safer when they're economically secure and people's lives are valued. That's so that's a huge thing that we could say more about as the semester goes on. Abolitionists do want to abolish prisons, right? But they aren't just claiming that abolishing prisons will happen overnight or that that's like the only thing. Rather, abolitionists' work is centered on what we call non-reformist reforms, or reforms that reduce the size and the power of the prison system instead of simply reorganizing that power, right? So, for instance, abolitionists are interested in ending solitary confinement and the death penalty. They fight to end the construction of new prisons, right? So there is a movement in New York City around no new jails because they're talking about closing Rikers Island, but not to reintegrate those people from Rikers Island in their communities and then change the structure of the system, but rather to build new prisons in new community facilities that essentially imprison people in their own neighborhoods, right? And they call that reform, right? Ending cash bail. Abolitionists are interested in ending fight to end cash bail, which holds poor people in jail even when they haven't been convicted of a crime. Right? Some actual famous people are really into the ending cash bail. A number of rappers like Jay-Z and Meek Mill are involved in ending cash bail. Right? Prison abolitionists, they oppose the expansion of punishment through hate crimes and surveillance, right? They advocate for universal health care because a community is safe when people are healthy and people are safe and economically secure, right? They advocate for alternative forms of conflict resolution like restorative justice and violence interruption, as opposed to more police, which oftentimes does very little but escalate problems, right? Accompanying prison abolition in that way, police abolitionists argue that the overall function of policing, and I'm not talking about individual cops who could be good or bad or whatever, but the overall function of policing is not to really protect and serve, but rather it is to manage social inequality through the state-sanctioned threat or use of violence. As the post-industrial society has become more unequal and precarious, right, public resources have been shifted away from social welfare, right, and towards security and order maintenance. The police are called to address social problems, but their only tools, this is important, but their only tools are those of violence and force. In poor communities of color, police don't really fix the problems, right? So the presence of more police or more police has not necessarily made those communities less poor or less, or having less problems, right? Oftentimes, in fact, the presence of police makes problems worse by getting people involved in like the criminal justice system that undermines communities and families, right? So a couple of ways that happens is police are called to respond to mental health crises, but of course, since their only real tools are really of those of force and arresting people, then that doesn't actually help those problems, right? The problems that the people are facing. They respond to typical juvenile misconduct with force and criminalization, which hurts those kids, the young people's future prospects, and costs money. Arrests undermine families and communities by oftentimes removing the breadwinners of those families, right? So it's a way, so oftentimes the criminal justice system and policing undermines families, right? Abolitionists argue that communities should invest in tools that strengthen and affirm communities such as schools, healthcare, housing, and economic security, instead of more police, right? In the aftermath of, say, like George Floyd's murder, calls to defund the police grew louder and more popular. Of course, the idea wasn't to simply get rid of police. It's never simply been to get rid of police. Rather, it's to build it's rather to build a society that doesn't rely on police to fix its problems. Rather, activists were calling for the disinvestment from policing in order to invest in structures and institutions that provide for community security. Like prison abolitionists, police abolitionists advocate for non-reformist reforms that reduce reliance on and investment in police. And that's a good link that y'all should check out on your own time. And last but not least, this is a shameless plug. I will be teaching a course next semester in spring 2022, Urban Studies 265 or 7601 for graduate students, called Abolitionism and Community Justice, right? Where we take a even deeper dive into all of these issues and solutions for them. And I will be teaching that on Thursday evenings from 6:30 to 8:30. It is a class that is in person, which I think will be really good, and it will fill up fast. So y'all check it out. And that ends my lecture for today's lecture on criminal injustice. I'm going to shut it down now and stop recording.